I'm excited to say that the results of our survey of urban biodiversity are in. First up, there was no relationship between the average size of the trees in our neighborhoods and the number of bird calls that we heard, which is a measure of the abundance of birds. There also was no relationship between the average size of the trees and the number of bird species, which is a measure of biodiversity. Now, this seems a bit surprising, but I think it makes sense, because different bird species are adapted to living in different habitats. There are some species that need mature trees to breed, but there are also other birds that do fine building their nests in younger trees or other locations. So in urban and suburban areas at least, areas that don't have these older mature trees might be able to support just as many birds as areas that do, although it's important to note that they may be a different set of species in these two different types of habitats. The other big surprise was that there was not a strong relationship between traffic disturbance and bird abundance or diversity. More on that later on. Now, the best predictor of bird abundance and diversity in our study was the number of trees. So the more trees there were, the more birds and the more bird species, although the effect with abundance seemed to be largely driven by some people who reported numbers from heavily forested areas. If we eliminate these outliers with more than 500 trees, you don't see this relationship anymore between the number of trees and the abundance of birds. But you do still see a clear trend where the areas with more trees support a greater diversity of bird species. In the discussion on Moodle, you guys made some really excellent points. First up, measuring diversity is hard. Counting bird calls, as many of you pointed out, is not at all easy, and it's rife with human error. For instance, it's hard to distinguish between different species, and it's also hard to know whether you're counting the same individual over and over again. Also, noise levels of the surrounding environment can affect what we are able to hear. And noise levels can even affect the bird's behavior. So for instance, maybe birds in noisier habitats call more loudly to compensate for the extra noise. And then there's the problem of this being a rather limited sample, statistically speaking. So for example, some birds are nocturnal, and other species are most active right at dawn, but don't tend to hang around in the evening when we were doing our observations. There's also the problem that weather can affect the amount of activity of birds. So it would be better if we did our study by taking measurements at multiple times of day over multiple days and then took an average. But even if our study isn't an accurate way of determining the exact number of species in an area, I think the rough count of bird calls that we did can still be a good way of comparing different places, provided we use consistent methods in those different places. It can also be a good method of seeing how diversity at a single place changes over time. For instance, if you repeated a study that you did next year and the year after. So there's no perfect way to measure biodiversity. We can't possibly count everything in an area. Instead, we have to make choices about the best way to do it. And birds are good because they're mostly diurnal and they're pretty conspicuous, as you guys heard. It's also relatively easy to learn to identify different bird species without being an expert. Plus, they're fun to watch. So ecologists have been counting bird biodiversity for decades. For instance, the Christmas bird count is probably the longest running survey of biodiversity in the world. It's been going on for 113 years now. It's run by the Audubon Society, and every year citizen volunteers from around the world head out in December to count birds in their area, working in teams. And today there are literally over 50,000 people in 17 different countries that take part. You can join in too. Many of you also commented on how surprised you were that you heard literally hundreds of bird calls in just a few minutes. There's a tremendous amount of activity going on that we usually don't notice. For me, the biggest surprise was that some of you heard hundreds of calls, even in areas with very high car traffic. Overall, there was no relationship in our study between traffic and bird diversity. Basically, we found between 5 and 15 species in the urban areas where we live, regardless of traffic. This was pretty surprising. But if you look at bird abundance, I think it's pretty telling that there's this big empty space in the upper right-hand corner of the graph. So in other words, there aren't any urban areas where there are hundreds of cars and hundreds of birds. I think if we did this study in less populated areas, we'd find that the diversity of birds would be way higher. For example, just north of Kingston at the Queen's University Biological Station, there are over 250 different species of birds that have been documented, and it's thought that at least 100 of those species actually breed in the area. Compare that to the 10 to 15 species that we observed in downtown Kingston. And we'd also maybe see different patterns if we studied more regions of the world. For example, at lower latitudes, towards the tropics, there are far more species of birds. In Bermuda, where Stephanie is, 375 different species of birds have been documented. And in Guatemala, where Michael was traveling earlier this month, 732 species of birds have been cited. So it would be really interesting to see how diversity and abundance at these other places respond to human disturbance. Okay, that's all I have to say for this week. Your next job in this course is to interpret the results of our mammal extinction study for project number 1. All of the instructions for this are found on Moodle. You can find links to the instructions and the data under Submit Project 1. The assignment is due Sunday, June 23, and you must upload it to Moodle in PDF format. And lastly, don't forget about quiz number 6. You have a few extra days to do it because I want you to work on project 1 as well, so quiz number 6 is due on Thursday, June 20. Good luck.